Hello, my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and I am back with A Way Through the Sea by Robert Elmer. And this is a historical novel, and we are on chapter 2. Numbers 1, 2, and 3. Too excited to sleep, Peter lay in his bed, thinking back to the year before, 1942, the year his birds had hatched. The first problem had been figuring out names for the ugly things, but Elise solved that on a Saturday morning when they were in their grandfather's boathouse down by the harbor. They had already waited 21 long days from the time the eggs were laid until they were hatched. Then, when they did, everyone was excited but kind of disappointed too. "Boy, are those things ugly," said Peter, wrinkling his nose at the 3 squirming creatures and bending down for a closer look. "They don't even open their eyes." He didn't mention that they were fat and blubbery with splotches of fluffy down here and there, or that they were mostly blue. Elise looked closely when Maxine, the mom, left the nest to get a drink. "Hey," agreed Henrik, combing his jet black hair with his left hand. He wasn't blonde and blue-eyed like Peter and Elise, but instead had the sharp, dark features that hinted strongly at a Jewish background. "I can see their veins and everything, and look at those crazy crooked beaks. Are you sure they're not baby vultures?" "Maybe they're part vultures," said Peter. "It's just too bad they can't come out cute and fuzzy like a baby chick or something." Well, you sure weren't born cute and fuzzy," snapped Elise. She and Peter had grown up sharing a lot of things, and they were still quite close. But sometimes, when they all got together with Henrik, Peter found his sister getting irritated at some of the things he said, like now. "So how do you know?" asked Peter, looking up at her with a grin. "Were you there or something?" "As a matter of fact, I was," she shot back, "for about a whole half an hour before you. Don't forget." "How can I when you remind me about it at least once a week?" Peter and Elise had faces that looked much the same, with their mom's strong, straight nose and their dad's steel blue eyes. And they were both kind of skinny with knobby elbows and knees. The main difference was that she had passed him up on the height chart in the living room 2 years earlier, something Peter tried to forget but couldn't. He also tried to forget that technically she was older than he was. Peter and Elise's grandfather, who was working on a piece of wood, only laughed at the conversation. "They're ugly, all right, but give them a few months. 6 months. They'll be flying around, growing feathers, and turning into big, beautiful homing pigeons." They looked over at the ugly chick's parents, who liked to strut around in the sunlight coming up from the window. The neck feathers of the birds turned different colors in the sun, green and blue mostly. In the case of the 3 new birds, this would have to be like the Hans Christian Andersen story where the ugly duckling turned into the beautiful swan. "Yeah," said Henrik, "but what are we going to call them now?" "How about the name Thor for one of them?" suggested Peter. He had been studying myths in school, which is how he thought of the name. He picked up a broom to sweep the floor a little, waiting for somebody to react to his suggestion. Elise held the end of a board for Grandfather at the workbench, looking thoughtful. "Nah," said Henrik. "It should fit with the other 2 names, like the 3 Musketeers or something. And besides, that sounds too much like a Norse myth." "It's supposed to," replied Peter. "So how about Trusty?" "Dog's name," said Henrik, giving a thumbs-down sign. "Checkers?" "Lightning?" "Forget it." "Tic-tac-toe?" Henrik just groaned, while Elise and Grandfather kept working. "Those are my suggestions," said Peter, shrugging. "I can't think of anything else." No one else said anything for a couple of minutes, and the only sound was Grandfather's steady sawing. "How about if we call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?" Henrik said finally. Peter thought he hadn't heard right. "Huh?" he said. "What language is that?" "You know, from the Bible story." Henrik looked amazed that his friend didn't know. "The one where they get thrown into a furnace, but they don't burn up?" Didn't they teach you that one in your church? Peter's family didn't go to the Lutheran church much, except on holidays like Christmas and Easter, the same as everyone else. Henrik seemed to know a lot more Bible stories than either Peter or Elise did. I must have missed that week, said Peter quickly, a little embarrassed. Anyway, there's no way I can pronounce those names. Henrik sighed and went back to looking out at the harbor through a little window. I have an idea, announced Elise. Grandfather picked up his board, and she clapped the sawdust from her hands. Henrik's bird was hatched first, right? Right, said Henrik, turning around, and he's still the best-looking one. What do you mean? Interrupted Peter. Yours hardly has its eyes open, and it can't hold up its head, and it looks all deformed. Deformed? Deformed? Yours is the one that's deformed with all that blubber. Elise raised her hands like a soccer referee. She was in the same grade as Henrik and Peter, and probably smarter than both of them. They wouldn't admit it, though, at least not yet. She knew all of the capitals of Europe by heart, and she often had to help Peter with his math. Her teachers at school said she was gifted. That was okay, Peter thought, as long as she didn't get bossy about it. Mostly he and Henrik listened to her ideas. Mostly, after all. She was the brain of the family. Okay, she said, we can hardly tell them apart just now, but since you two can't agree on a name, why don't we give them numbers? Henrik and Peter both looked at her as if maybe this was not one of her genius ideas. Grandfather Anderson started sawing on a new board, and Peter could tell he was listening too. But they already are going to have numbers, Peter said to her. Grandfather has the little rings ready. He was talking about 3 little aluminum rings his grandfather had out on the shelf, ready to slip around each bird's right leg. Grandfather had pulled the bands out of one of the drawers, the ones that were filled with bronze screws and bolts, small tools, and a whole collection of little orphaned things. Elise still sounded sure of herself. I know that, silly. Henrik's bird is going to be number 3,341. Yours is 3,342, and mine is 3,343. But I don't mean we should call them by their full numbers. We'll just call the first one number 1, the second one number 2, and mine number 3. Henrik and Peter just looked at each other, this time without their annoyed looks. What do you think? Asked Grandfather, who had picked up the rings. Do you boys have any better ideas? Peter shrugged. I guess not. Sounds good to me, even if it is a little different. I like different names, said Henrik, looking over at Elise. They're better than Trusty or Spot. She smiled back, the way she did when the boys finally came around to her ideas. Not, I told you so, but more like, what took you so long to figure it out? So with Grandfather's help, Peter held the helpless little birds as Elise and Henrik gently pulled the toes of their tiny feet backward and slipped the rings over their legs. Looks too big, observed Henrik when the rings were in place. They'll grow faster than you think, said Grandfather. Later, they gave number 1, number 2, number 3 a special feed dish all their own. Then over the next year, they worked at training them to be real homing pigeons. They kept busy with the birds every day after school and on the weekends. It took them a while to get the birds used to going through the bars, though. Even before the little pigeons learned how to fly well, Henrik climbed up on the roof of the shed and pushed them gently through the little hole with one-way bars, one at a time, until they had figured out how to do it themselves. It was kind of like a miniature jailhouse window, except that the bars swung in from the top. After a few weeks, they started learning how to get right back into the shed, where Elise would be waiting with their favorite treat, dried peas, in her hand. Gradually, the training flights got longer and longer until the 3 birds knew exactly how to come back home and go right into the shed without standing around on the roof making messes. Grandfather told Peter once that before the war he used to have a lot more messes, with 20 birds, all of them racing champions at one time or another. He had neatly pinned blue ribbons in a row on the wall inside his shed, proof of his stories. He had lots of stories. But that was before Peter had a story of his own. Thinking back to that year, It all seemed like a long, long time ago. And that is the end of chapter 2. No pictures. The next chapter, chapter 3, is the first race. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.